In Philadelphia in 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, holding that governments are instituted to secure certain fundamental rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again in Philadelphia in 1787, the members of the Constitutional Convention wrote a new constitution to secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. When the first Congress gathered for the first time in Philadelphia under the new Constitution, a Bill of Rights was the first order of business. James Madison, Virginia planter, father of the Constitution, co-author of the Federalist Papers, and future president, introduced the legislation and led the fight for what would become the Bill of Rights, which would further define the vaguely worded, unalienable rights described in the Declaration of Independence. Everyone did not necessarily agree with Mr. Madison. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury and leaders of the Federalist Party, never thought a Bill of Rights was a good idea.
The liberty of the press consists of the right to print, with impunity, truth with good motives, and for justifiable ends as it regards the government, its magistrates, or private individuals. This is exactly the sort of trouble I thought we would be mired in with this unnecessary Bill of Rights. I go further and affirm that a Bill of Rights is not only unnecessary, but would even be dangerous, for they would contain various exceptions to those powers not granted, and on that very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare these things shall not be done, which there is no power to do?
Ultimately, though, Mr. Hamilton was in the minority, and the Bill of Rights passed. Enshrined in the First Amendment of the newly passed Bill of Rights were 5 freedoms that form the core of democracy: religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly. For many of the first colonists, they had made the long journey to the New World for the very freedoms, and these 5 freedoms would play a role in American constitutional thought.
Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Oh, forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death.
Serving as President Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson was not in Congress for the debate surrounding the passage of the Bill of Rights. But as a fellow Virginian, friend of James Madison, and author of the Declaration of Independence, his insight into the logic of the First Amendment helps explain how all 5 rights fit together.
Each of the 5 rights that are listed in the First Amendment have to do with freedom of expression of opinion. Some of them have more to do with the means of expressing the opinion, and some are the opinion themselves. But that mechanism for protecting freedom of opinion is encapsulated by those 5 rights listed. The 5 rights having to do with freedom of expression listed in the First Amendment, and many other rights not listed, are absolutely and fundamentally important to democracy, because the kind of government we've established, which includes democracy, is based on drawing from the intellectual and creative resources of all the people. This is as opposed to other nations in which one person or a small group of people are the authority over all and listen to no other opinions. Their resources then for solving problems and developing new ideas are limited, where ours are the entire nation.
In the early republic, freedom of speech and freedom of the press were uniquely intertwined. The press, in the form of broadsheets, pamphlets, gazettes, and more, was how citizens expressed themselves to a large audience. It was through the press that citizens questioned government and aired their complaints, many of which became quite personal.
Falsehoods and lies. These gazettes, they are an outrage upon common decency.
Now, my dear Patsy, in a free and republican government, you cannot restrain the voice of the multitude. Every man will speak as he thinks, or more properly, every man will speak without thinking.
Would you just indulge me as I read but a few of these very blatant falsehoods? In the office of the presidency, Mr. Washington's lack of understanding renders him dangerous in public affairs.
The things which I do for the peace and safety of the people of this country are well approved by my fellow citizens.
Well, let's see. Let's try another. Mr. Washington's specious show of disinterest serves to cover a subtle selfishness.
The arrows of malevolence, however barbed and well pointed, never can touch the most vulnerable part of me. Though, while I am up as a mark, they will be continually aimed.
Mr. Washington is more fitted for a royal court than for a republic.
Royal court?
Royal court.
These gazettes teem with all the invective that disappointment, ignorance of facts, and malicious falsehoods can invent, with the sole purpose to misrepresent my politics and affections, and to wound my reputation and feelings.
And yet, these discontented men, they are free to publish whatever they desire about the character of the president. Will this not soon destroy the confidence of the people in their public servants?
If the government and the officers of it are to be the constant theme for newspaper abuse, and this too without condescending to investigate the motives or the facts, it will be impossible for any man living to manage the helm or to keep the machine together.
While the rights of free speech and press must be guaranteed, are there some fair limits that ought to be placed on these rights? What is the responsibility of the American citizen who publishes an editorial or speaks out in protest? President Adams was a regular target of a vitriolic press that once referred to him as, quote, a blind, bald, crippled old man, and dubbed him, quote, his rotundity during his presidency. Though believing in the freedom of the press, Mrs. Adams was none too pleased.
I cannot fathom that President Jefferson has pardoned Callender from his libel conviction and remitted his fine.
One of his first acts as president is to liberate that wretch. Callender was suffering the just punishment of law for writing and publishing the basest of libel and slander against you. Oh, such a remission could be viewed as a public approbation by Jefferson of Callender's conduct.
There is nothing can be done now. I am fairly out. Jefferson is fairly in. Let us see who among us is happier.
Well, they never should have let the Sedition Act expire. The Constitution never meant to withhold the power of self-defense from the national government. And when such vipers are let loose upon society, all distinction between virtue and vice is leveled. All respect for character is lost, including that respect which is a necessary element in the social bond and gives efficacy to law.
If they simply permit truth to be entered as evidence to the jury, there is nothing to fear. Even Hamilton agreed with the Sedition Act once truth was permissible as evidence.
You're agreeing with Hamilton now?
Good heavens! Let us say that he agrees with me, and never speak of it again. When people talk of freedom of speaking, or writing, or thinking, I cannot choose but laugh. No such thing ever existed. No such thing exists now. I hope that it shall exist. But I fear it will be hundreds of years after you and I shall read and speak no more.
Well, I will never accept that it could be an infringement of the press to punish the licentiousness of it.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were drafted in Congress during the Adams presidency in response to the attacks on the government from those who supported the French Revolution. Under these laws, essentially, it became illegal to criticize the government, including the president and the houses of Congress, especially in the press. those from other countries who were not citizens saw that it became more difficult to become a citizen and easier to be deported under the new laws. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and President John Adams signed the bills into laws.
When freedom of speech is discussed, inevitably someone asks me about the Alien and Sedition Acts, to which I would reply, why don't you ask Jefferson? He is as responsible for the Alien and Sedition Acts as I am, by which I mean his name is affixed to them as vice president, as mine was as president. Our signatures were the extent of our involvement. Neither one of us wrote them, neither one of us asked for them, but the Congress created and passed these acts to protect this country from spies in our midst, and in the case of the Sedition Act, to protect this young government from false, scandalous, and malicious speech, publication, and printed, designed to malign or to destroy this government and its officers. Now, Judge William Blackstone believed that liberty of the press is essential for a free state, but only in its ability to publish, not in freedom from censure or prosecution once published. And if I may act as defense for the Sedition Act, common law, the law of several of our states, did not permit truth to be entered as a defense against malicious libel, nor were prosecutors required to prove malicious intent, only that it was published. The Sedition Act requires both, thus demanding a more just approach to prosecuting libel.
Though President Jefferson pardoned those who had been convicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts and quietly allowed the acts to expire, the debate on the limits of free speech would continue. Mr. Jefferson, who did not believe in a strong central government, usually favored a very liberal approach to free speech.
Freedom of speech and press are simultaneously unlimited and limited. I believe that the federal government has no right to limit freedom of speech and press, short of treason, of course, sharing military secrets. However, I do believe that this is a states' rights issue, where states do have a responsibility to punish those who have engaged in slander or libel. It is important, though, for me, that the First Amendment limits the federal government almost completely on this issue.
To this day, there is no universal agreement on the meaning of freedom of speech and freedom of the press found in the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court regularly weighs in, but in a democracy, only the citizens who are engaged in the debate can help decide whether there are limits to our liberties and where our responsibilities lie in exercising those liberties.